Welcome to the Harriet Beecher Stowe House online. And our discussion series, After Uncle Tom's Cabin, Black Voices for Justice. Tonight's topic is After Abolition, Looking Back and Looking Forward, with authors Charles Chesnutt and Alice Dunbar Nelson. And I see many of you are regulars, but in case we have any new visitors, so to speak, this is kind of what our format is, and that is to, John Getz will put up a timeline and talk a little bit about the timeline, because we always like to contextualize, kind of give some historical context in terms of how Harriet's writing is related to the current authors that we're looking at. And then after that discussion about the timeline, then we'll go into his questions, and we have Jerry, who is with us as well, Jerry Cline-Bailey, who is a professor at Xavier. John Getz, of course, is a retired Xavier professor, and so we'll let them take over with the discussion, and he's got some questions to get us started. Most of you probably got a copy of the timeline and discussion questions just so that you would have them available. But I'm going to put them up on the screen here in just a minute. So again, our format is kind of some, information and then discussion. When we get to the discussion part, feel free to jump right in if you have a question. If you're not getting you're not fast enough, just raise your virtual hand, and I will make sure that you get called on so that you can join the discussion as well. Or if you're shy, you can type things into the chat and we'll get to it that way as well. So we have multiple formats for discussing. I also want to point out that we do have a new season sponsor for the After Uncle Tom's Cabin series, and that is School Outfitters, who apparently has some really cool school and meeting educational furniture kinds of stuff. So we'll have some information about that on our website coming up in the next couple days. So I'm going to let John and Jerry get us started, and I'm sure John wants me to start with the timeline picture.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Nope, wrong one. Hang on. I'm getting there.
Well, it's good to see everybody. Glad to be with you all. And here we come with the screen sharing. And this is a slightly longer timeline than usual, only because the lives of these people were so complex, and they did so many things both in writing and in activism. So that's what I would say first about the timeline. Just to give you a quick overview. We always relate everything to Harriet Beecher Stowe, and you'll see that the first date on here is Uncle Tom's Cabin. So that tells you already all of what we're going to talk about tonight is after Uncle Tom's Cabin, fitting the overall theme of our discussions this year. And we have Chestnut and Dunbar Nelson have a lot in common. Chestnut's older than she is, but and he was actually born before the Civil War, but born to free people of color up in Cleveland, Ohio. So there's an Ohio connection. And there is with both of them, although only by marriage for Alice Dunbar Nelson. She was married for a few years to Paul Laurence Dunbar of Dayton fame, the famous poet and fiction writer. So that's her Ohio connection. But Chestnut has a lot of connections with Ohio. He was born here, lived then for a while in North Carolina, grew up in North Carolina, but moved back to Cleveland, and that's where he spent most of his adult life. Something else that these two writers have in common is light skin. Both of them could have passed for white if they had chosen to, but were very intentional about not doing that. I have read that occasionally Dunbar Nelson would, only if she wanted to go swimming or go to the theater or something and not be hassled and get into a place where Black people weren't welcome. But in general, and certainly in her writing and her public life as both an educator and a writer, she was very consistent about identifying herself as Black. Both of them had good educations, and both of them spent time in the classroom as teachers and as administrators, and both were political activists. Their lives, when you look at the timeline, we'll go through it a little bit more carefully, but in general, their lives spanned the period from Reconstruction, their active lives, professional lives, the period from Reconstruction up to and through a good part of the Harlem Renaissance, which is usually dated at 1918 to the mid-1930s, and both of them died in the 1930s. Another way to think of it is their writing spans Jim Crow, the Jim Crow period, from there to the Harlem Renaissance. The last thing that they have in common is that they were both overlooked for a long time in the American literary canon. When I studied American literature, Alice Dunbar Nelson was nowhere to be found in the anthologies. Chesnutt would be in there with a story or two, maybe one or both of the stories that you read tonight, but he was seen mainly as a local color writer, local color carrying a bit of a negative connotation as just giving you a sort of quaint look at a particular part of the country at a particular moment in time, and not trying to tackle any serious themes. Well, I'm sure from your reading you would see the flaws in that view of Chesnutt, and Dunbar Nelson got a little bit of that same treatment once she started to be noticed by people. She was just seen as a kind of New Orleans local color writer at first, but now people are taking much more serious looks at both of these folks. So Stowe publishes Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. Chesnutt's born 6 years later in Cleveland, but his family has roots in North Carolina, and that's where he grows up, in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Alice Ruth Moore, later to be Dunbar Nelson, was born in New Orleans to an unidentified father and a formerly enslaved mother who raised her with some help from an aunt. There's one error on the timeline. It says 1870 Chesnutt becomes a teacher. That really should be 1873, and the school administration comes just a little bit after that. He would have been pretty young to be a teacher and administrator in 1870, but they did start quite young. Harriet herself was a teacher at a pretty young age, teenage teacher in her sister's school back in Connecticut. 1880, skip ahead to that, and you see Joel Chandler Harris, somebody we'll talk about a little bit later, publishing the Uncle Remus stories. He had already published some. He was an Atlanta newspaper writer, and collected some in a book and continued to do that for years after that. Enormous sales, very popular, and we'll talk about Chesnutt in relation to the Uncle Remus stories a little bit later. Chesnutt, once as an adult, wound up in Cleveland and ran a very successful legal stenography business. He eventually passed the bar with a very high grade. He was an attorney, but ran a successful legal stenography business. His breakthrough in writing came in 1887 when the Atlantic Monthly, that very prestigious publication, published the Goophered Grapevine and followed it up the next year with Poe Sandy, the two stories that you read for tonight. Alice Dunbar Nelson, or Alice Moore, became Alice Dunbar in 1898 when she married Paul. It was not a successful marriage. She had great respect for his work and he for hers. But he had trouble with alcoholism, poor health, and was violent. And so she had to leave 4 years later. They separated. They never divorced, but he died then in 1906. Chesnutt's first book publication, The Conjure Woman, collected a number of tales like the ones you read tonight. That was in 1899. It sold very well. Alice Dunbar, which is the name she went by once she got married to Paul, published her short story collection also in 1899. The Goodness of St. Roque and other stories, which include Sister Josepha, which you read for tonight. So same year, big breakthrough. Both these authors get their first books published. Sometime between 1900 and 1910, Alice Dunbar, still using that name, wrote The Stones of the Village, the other story that you read for tonight. It was not published in her lifetime. I always put in a plug in 1901 for Chesnutt's great novel, The Marrow of Tradition, based on the Wilmington, North Carolina coup d'etat by white supremacists in a couple of years before that. And with his roots in North Carolina, Chesnutt was very engaged with this topic. And it's a terrific book. If you've never read it, which a lot of people haven't, I would really recommend it to you. It's very different from the Conjure stories, much more like some of the short stories that he wrote that we read earlier a couple of years ago. Starting in 1902, Alice Dunbar goes to Wilmington, Delaware, where she lives for 18 years and teaches at a black high school there, and gets fired 18 years later for attending a social justice day event. That might not seem like grounds for firing, but they had a strict law against a rule for their teachers that they weren't allowed to do anything political. And this did have political overtones because it was held in Marion, Ohio, organized by presidential hopeful Warren Harding, trying to formulate racial policies for his hope for administration, and he did win the election. She is also, besides being a teacher for a long time, and she would teach elsewhere after that, besides being a teacher, she published a lot of material about education, encouraging the development of a Black American literary canon, and trying to provide texts for Black kids to read so they would have models, role models to follow, both for their writing and for their lives. So that's where in 1914, Masterpieces of Negro Eloquence, the best speeches delivered by the Negro from the days of slavery to the present time, where that comes from. By 1915, we find her organizing for women's suffrage, and we find Chesnutt protesting successfully the showing of The Birth of a Nation in Cleveland. That film, and here's another connection with Harriet, because Birth of a Nation was a retort coming from the South toward Uncle Tom's Cabin and toward her picture and many other pictures of slavery that had been put out there. The Ku Klux Klan is the hero of Birth of a Nation. This film, which was based on Thomas Dixon's novel called The Klansman. So Harriet's shadow is still over the South, and they're still reacting against her as late as 1915. Alice Dunbar becomes Alice Dunbar Nelson in 1916, marrying the journalist and activist Robert Nelson. What to call her exactly, people don't know if they should call her Alice Moore, Alice Dunbar, but Dunbar Nelson seems to be the contemporary, or the consensus choice, and it is a name that she continued to use. She used either the hyphenated or the non-hyphenated form of Dunbar Nelson for the rest of her life. By 1920, she's publishing another important book for schools, The Dunbar Speaker and Entertainer, containing the best prose and poetic selections by and about the Negro race. She included some of her ex-husband's work in there. And she also, this always strikes me as very interesting, she included the work of white writers writing about Black people, but marked them with an asterisk as white writers. So they're the other in this book, the white writers, not the Black writers. She also published Negro literature for Negro pupils in 1922, again, trying to build a Black literary canon. Worked against lynching, taught at a kind of reform school for Black girls. So very active. And then both of them continued to do a variety of things, writing and activism, until their deaths in the 1930s. So that's kind of the overview of these two authors. So let me now turn it over to Jerry who will talk to us a little bit about Conjure and get us going on the discussion of the Conjure stories. Jerry, you're muted, I think. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, yes. I said I want to just preface my remarks by being a little personal here, just talking a little about myself. Right, so I was born in Africa, a place called Sierra Leone, but my family moved to England, London, England, when I was 18 months old. So I spent the first, let me see, about 9 years of my life in London and then moved back to Africa. So in school in Africa, one of the first books that I read was Kamara Lai's, it's published here in the US as The Dark Child. It's an autobiographical story. And there's a part of the story in which he talks about his mother having magical powers. So he prefaces this section by writing a whole paragraph about how he knows that people would not believe what he's about to tell us, but he saw these things that he's about to tell us with his own eyes. And then he goes on to talk about his mother walking into a crocodile-infested river and the crocodiles not bothering her because she had some mystical power over them. I remember reading this and thinking, this is ridiculous, right? I mean, crocodiles eat people, right? So fast forward now, several years later, I'm at Xavier University, and well, I'm working at Xavier University, and I am in Ghana, in West Africa, with 10 Xavier students who are going to spend the semester, you know, studying African religions, languages, doing volunteer work, and so on and so forth. And we take a field trip. So on this field trip, we were going to see the places from which slaves were taken in the interior and then led on a march to the coast. So on our way, the driver says, oh, we're just about to pass a village where crocodiles interact with people. Do you guys want to see it? And I said, yeah, sure, of course. So we get there. So we take this detour, get to the village, and a bus full of foreigners. And the villager says, you've come to see the crocodiles. Give us $1 and we'll demonstrate something for you. So we give them $1. This gentleman goes to the back of our hut and comes back with 3 little chickens. While he was in the back, I was looking at a lake with some logs, you know, floating in the lake, and kids ranging from about, I'd say about 3 to 8 years of age, just horsing around in this lake. So now this gentleman with the chickens says something, and suddenly these logs come alive. They're crocodiles. And now they advance towards us, standing, you know, by the side of the lake. And now the man turns to us. He says, you want to see something? He said, yeah, sure. So he throws one of the chickens up in the air, and the crocodiles jump up, and the biggest one catches the chicken. Now the man turns to us and says, okay, do you want to ride a crocodile? I said, what? He says, yeah, they're tame, you know, they'll let you sit on them. So he saw that I was nervous. So then he said, well, okay, just pet the crocodile. And the crocodile let me pet it. They just sat there and let us do this. So I'm reminded then of that scene that I had read in Kamara Lai's story and my reaction to it. And now here I am as a full-grown man seeing something that I know no one would believe. I had to actually have that videotaped. I eventually did sit on this live crocodile and had it videotaped because I know no one would believe this if I tell them when I come to the States. So this is, I've wanted to present this to you as a background for what I'm about to say with regard to Conjure. Because there's some mysteries in Africa that are still not understood. So let me quickly pull up my notes here. So Conjure in African American culture is also known as root work or hoodoo. It has its origins in African traditional religious practices, many of which have been traced to ancient kingdoms, ancient African kingdoms, such as Dahomey, which occupied part of present-day Nigeria and the neighboring country of the Republic of Benin, and also the Kingdom of Congo. These practices are often misunderstood. They involve magic, divination, the casting of spells, and the utilization of or marshalling of supernatural forces. Conjurers could be male or female, and they're highly respected as well as feared in their communities, not only in Africa, but also in African American culture. Conjure continues to thrive in African American culture in the same way that Haitian voodoo, Santeria in Cuba, and Candomblé in Brazil thrive. So Africans came over with their spiritual beliefs, and some of those spiritual beliefs have actually spilled over into the practice of Christianity. So in Black churches in the African diaspora, not only in the United States now, but across the Americas, you will see certain practices which have roots in traditional African religions. An example of the continued influence of African religions or religious practices in present-day America can be seen in the popularity of zombies in movies and films. So I pronounce the word zombie, it's like an Americanized pronunciation. The African word from which it comes is zombie. And the zombie is a reanimated corpse, not really alive, but could be used by the person, the conjurer, for either good or evil purposes. So the point I'm trying to make here then is that we have these aspects of African culture that still are retained in African American culture and have actually seeped into the broader culture in America, and we often don't even realize it. So when we talk about voodoo, people will often refer to it condescendingly. Yet there is this fear of the power of voodoo. If you think about certain things like, dolls with pins in them, which are used to cast spells, there is this lurking fear beneath the surface. So most people, if you ask them, oh, do you believe in voodoo? They'll say no. Yet, they're not gonna mess with someone who is a practitioner of voodoo. And I often tease my classes when we're studying literature and we talk about the difference between religion and superstition. Where do you draw the line? And often they'll say, well, you know, we don't believe in voodoo and that kind of stuff. And I'll tell them, you know, I lived in Africa, I learned certain spells, and I can actually cast a spell on a volunteer in the class. Who would like to volunteer for me to cast a spell? And I've never had anyone accept. So even though they don't believe, they say they don't believe in this, yet they're not willing to volunteer for me to cast a spell. I usually tell them it's a joke. Later on, I tell them it's a joke. I don't know any voodoo spells. So in reading the story, Chestnut Stories, I was fascinated by the retention of these beliefs and also in the portrayal of some of the characters who are respected within the society for their use of these spells. So with that little background then, I guess I wanted to introduce the question, does one have to believe? Let me read the question again. Yes. Do you have to believe in Conjure to appreciate Chesnutt's Conjure stories? Okay, it seems like Dan wanted to say something.
Hang on, Dan, we can't hear you.
There you go.
You actually.
Jerry, I would say, no, you don't. There's an appreciation whether you believe in conjuring or not. You just have to, but you do, I believe, I agree with you that you do have to believe in the respect that the community has for the conjurers. But I don't think you have to have a belief in that they are actually casting the real spells. But nonetheless, I think you need to respect in the story the conjurers. I think that's a necessity to understand the story itself, is to see the respect that was given to them.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody else want to comment?
Yeah, I think in terms of the couple that moved to North Carolina, I want to say North Carolina, the couple that moved to North Carolina, I don't think they believed in the Conjurer story. I mean, he went ahead and bought the Grapevine, or he went ahead and bought the vineyard, even though he had been told this story. You don't have to believe what's going on, but the guy telling the story tells a really good story, doesn't he? Yeah. So it's like, you're kind of like, yeah, I guess that can happen. But it really just, it's more of a part of the ambiance of the culture that Chestnut is portraying, I think. Mm-hmm.
I would further say, and poor Sally, is that was what it was?
Sandy.
Poor Sandy. In that story, along with, I've been fortunate to read all the Conjure stories. The storyteller is a con man. He's having a lot of fun with this. He is having loads of fun because he's always trying to get what he wants in the end. He wants to have a place where he can go drinking with his buddies, and he doesn't want the schoolhouse torn down. That's the bottom line that happens. And so he's got to have a story to go with that to sort of frighten the naive landowners into acting in the way that he's very successful with in the stories. Just be out of respect again. I think the young couple has respect for him to trick them into not doing things he doesn't want done.
Can I jump in here? I think that in this Goophered Grapevine story, I think it's interesting that Dougal kind of plays like kind of blends from side to side of the fear to like the disbelief of the conjuring, you know, like he laughs like, oh, that was a good investment of $10 to, you know, trick these enslaved people into thinking that the grapevine is, you know, going to get them if they steal the grapes or whatever. But then later on, he kind of buys into it because he realizes, oh, I can make some money off of this because it really is happening, you know, like Henry really is becoming young and old and young and old. So it kind of makes the reader think, where do I stand on this? You know, like I could stand on the outside of this and kind of say, oh yeah, he's just telling a story. But you could also get drawn into it and feel the fear part of it. Like, oh, is this real? You know, it kind of makes the story more interesting that way.
Yeah, I have I was thinking about another situation that I experienced in Ghana when I was reading this story. So Ghanaians are known as very good craftsmen with wood. So you would see these beautiful furniture displayed outside of the showroom, just sometimes on the sidewalk. And the craftsmen, I mean, these pieces are really very well made. They'll often be left outside at the end of the day instead of put back into the showroom or the where they were crafted. They would just be put outside there as an advert. So you could walk by at night and see this beautiful bed or sofa, and it's just out there. So I remember asking, what, aren't there thieves in Ghana? Don't people steal stuff? I mean, this is really valuable stuff. And the cab driver who I asked this said, yeah, no one's going to steal that stuff. I said, why? He said, well, it's obviously cursed. Someone's put a spell on it, right? I mean, they're not going to leave something this valuable out there. So everyone knows that if you steal something like this, there's a curse attached to it. So people don't steal this kind of stuff. You just put it out there. And I thought, wow, well, this does work, really. This belief system does work because it prevents people from stealing.
Mm-hmm.
So it has a purpose. And just like in the story. Any other comments?
I think the way Dan was describing Julius, the storyteller, is that he's a kind of conjurer too, with words.
Yes, which brings us to the trickster tradition. Right. So is this a good time then to transition to talk about the trickster tradition?
Sure. I think so.
Okay. So again, this trickster tradition in African-American storytelling has a direct connection to Africa. So I wanted to talk, John mentioned Joel Chandler Harris, who collected a lot of stories that were folk tales that formerly enslaved people told. So I wanted to make sure that we're aware of the fact that there's this tradition of storytelling with a purpose in traditional Africa. I'll take one particular instance to illustrate it. Okay, so I want to talk about the Anansi stories. Anansi in the Twi language spoken by the Ashanti people in West Africa. They live in modern day Ghana, right? Anansi means spider. So the spider is viewed as a trickster. Wily. It weaves a web and then lures its prey into the web. In fact, that spider is symbolic. I don't know if you've heard of kente cloth.
Sure.
The traditional brightly colored woven cloth. Right. The legend has it that the person who invented that weaving method was studying the spider. Okay, so the spider then is a symbol of craftiness and so on and so forth. So now the Anansi stories had a social purpose in traditional Africa, in traditional Ashanti society. Among them include moral instruction, conflict avoidance, and dispensing of wisdom. So let me see if I could just talk about conflict avoidance. So in the Anansi stories, the characters are usually animals, not people, for a reason. These animals then would represent people. So let's imagine a situation where John and I are neighbors, and John has done something that upsets me. Instead of me directly confronting John, I say to John, John, have you heard the story about Anansi, the spider, who did X, Y, and Z? Right? I tell him the story, and then John, understanding that tradition, tries to figure out which one of the animals in that story is he supposed to represent. And then to figure out what it is that he might have done that might have upset me. Right. So the stories are told as a way of avoiding confrontation. I tell you the story. I'm not talking about you, John. I'm just telling you a story about the spider and the goat and the spider and the squirrel and so on and so forth. And then your job is to figure out which one of the animals are you. So when I read Joel Chandler Harris's stories, I see so many of those traditional stories that I heard from older people in West Africa, right? Some of them are standard, like, let me see now. There's a Nigerian writer from going back to the 1940s and 50s, whose name is Amos Tutuola, who tells these stories, these traditional African stories. And one of them is called The Palm Wine Drinkard, right? It's a story about this guy who, I mean, his talent is drinking palm wine, but he also has magical powers. And he uses those magical powers to dupe people into giving him whatever he wants, giving him lots of palm wine and so on and so forth. So when I started reading these conjure stories, I could actually see this connection then between the Anansi stories, Joel Chandler Harris's stories, and Chestnut's stories, where you have this character who is supposed to teach us something about what not to do or what to do. Yes, go ahead. You're about to ask a question.
No, I was just going to interject because I in case people are not familiar with the name Joel Chandler Harris,
yeah.
It's the Uncle Remus stories, and the Brer Rabbit, and the Brer Rabbit being the trickster character in the Uncle Remus stories. So that's kind of the connection there. Sorry.
Yes, thank you very much for saying that. Right. So on the one hand, we have the supernatural that we just talked about, and now we have this trickster element. And it seems like Chesnutt is blending those two traditions in these conjure stories. And I find that fascinating, that these elements have been retained in the African-American storytelling tradition. And just before we started, I was talking about even the fact that this Chestnut writes in dialect. It's so informative because as a linguist, I'm reading the dialect and I'm actually seeing connections between how these characters speak and how people would communicate in African languages. And I'm actually seeing the Africanisms in the way in which the story is told, in terms of the pronunciation, sentence structure, and so on and so forth. So I'll just stop there for now. And then I guess we could move on to talk about, well, we could maybe talk about how those aspects that we've just addressed affected either your enjoyment or your understanding of the story.
This is Amber, and I do not care for this dialect. It just really slows it down, and you just have to really take your time. And so it's hard for me to appreciate and enjoy when it just takes all this stopping and trying to make out what the person is saying.
Okay, so I'm very interested in your response. I don't know if it would be too intrusive to ask if you're African American. Would it?
Yes, I am.
Okay, all right. So the reason why I asked is because a lot of African and African American history is not told. And part of this has to do with the fact that we have this oral tradition. And the oral tradition is sometimes revered over the written tradition. There's certain things which your grandma tells you, certain things that are passed on, by word of mouth. So, sometimes it's not what is said, but rather how it is said that conveys the meaning. You can have the same sentence said 3 different ways, but it's how it's said that may convey the meaning. And how it is said is sometimes lost when we have this uniform way of writing the English language. Right. So, for example, if you just take just take a simple word like ICE, ice. In some parts of the country, that word is pronounced and it sounds like ASS, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Right. So something's lost there. So if I said ass, but wrote it down as ice, now something has been lost because my twang, my dialect, my accent has been sanitized. And when a writer spends a lot of time, it's not easy really to write non-standard English. It's not easy because we are trained to spell in a standard way. When a writer goes through all that effort to capture the phonetics, the actual pronunciation of the words, this is part of characterization. They want you to hear the twang. Faulkner does it a lot in his stories. He does it a lot. He wants you to hear how this sounds because it makes the character more authentic. And I feel like maybe the problem that we have with portraying poor Black people as speaking this way is because there are these biases. So if someone shows up speaking in that kind of dialect and says that they are a rocket scientist, we're not going to believe them because it is assumed that you cannot be intelligent if you speak that way. And that is far from the truth. Just because you speak a certain dialect, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are unintelligent. So I feel I actually embrace the use of the dialects, even though it's difficult to understand. You're forced to spend a little more time listening to a way of speaking which you might otherwise dismiss. If you hear someone speaking like that, you think, oh, this person is ignorant, what do they have to tell me? And you might not pay enough attention. But in a forum like this, where we're reading with a purpose, we're forced to slow down and be patient. I mean, we live in an age where we're very impatient. And even for short stories, it's like, okay, can you get on with the story? Why is it taking so long? But we have to slow down sometimes to be able to extract the wisdom. And those are my reactions to the points just made.
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning that. And, you know, I do respect these writings. You know, they are historical from Black writers trying to preserve like our culture and our history and how we talk. And so I do appreciate that where you said, you know, it may get sanitized. And so I'm wondering if one thing, yeah, I am like an impatient person, but I'm wondering if one thing that would help me too is if I did try to read this out loud.
Yeah.
But it is almost like reading a foreign language. Like it's like me trying to like read just a foreign language and trying to pronounce it. But I'm wondering if that would just help a bit with just trying to appreciate it more. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Amber, this is Susan, and I will tell you that when I was an undergraduate, I took a folklore class that was much in line with what we're talking about tonight by a man named John Stewart. And one of the books that he assigned was called Drums and Shadows. And it's the WPA Writers Project that went into the Georgia Seacoast Islands. And he actually had us sit in class and read it out loud so that we could understand the rhythm of the language, the meaning, the vernacular. Not what we think it should be, but how it actually does change when you speak it out loud. And you'll find if you read something like Paul Laurence Dunbar's poems out loud, the vernacular really comes out. And believe it or not, the same holds true with Mark Twain when you read something like Huckleberry Finn. When you read the passages out loud, it has a different taste in your mouth, and then it connects something in your brain, and you're like, oh yeah, I have heard that before. So
Yeah.
you know, you're not crazy if you stand there and you're reading it, and it actually is kind of a treat to read this stuff in the vernacular as opposed to what we think is on that page.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
Yeah, thank you. That's cool.
So, John, you want to take over?
Okay, yeah, we're in the interest of coverage here. I think maybe we should move on to Alice Dunbar Nelson. There's a lot more, obviously, a whole lot more we could say about these Chestnut stories, but we can always come back to them at the end if there's time. But I want to make sure that that we give Alice Dunbar Nelson her due as well. So we had one of the questions that we had posted for people to think about, question number 3. In the story, Sister Josepha, do you think Camille, Sister Josepha, should have stayed in the convent or taken her chances in the outside world of New Orleans or wherever she might go? So I'd be interested in what people have to say about that.
I wanted to say something about that. I think Camille should have taken her chances outside of the convent because, like she had said in the story, she didn't have a chance to figure out who she was. She didn't know her background or anything before she came to the convent. So her only identity was with the convent and the sisters. She didn't get to experience life outside or having a true like mother and father figure. Of course, she had a mother figure, Mary, but she didn't really have that whole side outside of her faith.
So you want to see her go, get out there and seek her fortune.
It's important for people to explore who they are, and she wasn't able to do that.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
I can see parallels between that and the ending of the Stones of the Village, because it's a terrifying choice, right? You're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. You don't fit into either culture, and both are dangerous. To stay in one is suffocating, and the other could potentially be your death, right? Because of other people rebelling against who you are. And that question that comes up in both of them, what am I, right? That's the one that everything hinges on.
Yeah, I saw that part of the story as a very sad part. She was at a crisis of courage, and it was courageous for her to do either one, actually. But it would have been, in my opinion, more courageous for her to leave. But nonetheless, it was a decision, a courageous decision, also for her to stay in her religious experiences. So I found that a very disturbing, sad part of the story of having to make that decision, and courage either way. I mean, her in the pew crying over her rosary beads as she makes the decision is very moving, I thought.
Suppose she leaves. What do you think happens? Would she find her seek her fortune, or she could seek it, but what's her future, do you think, if she does leave?
I think she would have a really good chance of doing well for herself. And the reason I say that is because she was able to recognize the danger of, you know, when the couple came to potentially adopt her, she recognized that that was not a good situation to be in, and that she made sure that she stayed out of that situation. So the fact that she was able to recognize that, and recognize that the guy would have been a sexual predator, really makes me feel like, okay, she could make her way in the world and really understand personal relationships, and make sure that she stays in, or make sure that she, you know, is not taken advantage of, because she knows what to look for.
What tips the scales for her? What, because she's all sort of primed to go and then backs away from it. Why? What causes her to lose her nerve? Anybody remember the discussion between the two nuns about her? She's not sleeping well. Their Sister Francesca says, I'm worried about her. And suggests, I'm very worried about her, and if she leaves, she has no name but Camille. Right, she's Sister Josepha if she stays in the convent. She has that name. That's certainly not a great life. She doesn't have a religious vocation. She's not happy there at all. And one critic has said, Sister Josepha, Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his family in the Bible. So that's not such a great, maybe great future either. And then there's Father Ray in there, who lingered longer at his blessing when his hands pressed her silky hair. So that's not a great, not a point in favor of the convent either. And what we know about priestly sexual abuse in later years probably causes us to notice that even more. But something gets her when the one nun says she has no name but Camille. What's the implication of that?
I immediately thought that there are questions about her identity with regard to parentage, and because these Dunbar stories give me the vibe of Kate Chopin.
Yeah.
I thought, okay, so there's a hidden story in terms of maybe her birth and her racial identity.
So these are the strikes she's got going against her if she goes out on her own. She doesn't have any money. She doesn't have an identifiable family behind her. Mm-hmm. And she has limited education from what she got in the convent, and her racial identity is uncertain. Given all that, it's not a great option for her either way. I think somebody said that before, I think. And we had that discussion about Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing over the weekend. What's the right thing for her to do? I don't know if there is a right thing in this case. Chris, do you want to say something? Oh, okay. It's a tough, it's kind of a no-win situation, it seems to me. I mean, there are cons on both sides. Maybe some pros, safety in the convent, a chance to make it in the outside world, but boy, she has a lot going against her. This is, 1899 in New Orleans, a very traditional society, stratified society. And then there's that name Camille. Alexander Dumas's novel, The Lady of Camellias, which was eventually the opera La Traviata. The Lady of the Camellias is a prostitute and does not come to a good end at the end of, sorry for the spoiler, but there's a hint that prostitution might be her likeliest fate if she left. But I'm happy to see people are hopeful. I mean, you can't disprove that, I think. So I'm not saying you're wrong to think that she should leave. There's plenty of stuff wrong with her staying in the convent, but it's no easy, the odds are against her, I think, whatever she does.
This is Amber again. And what helps me with this, though, because I do find this like heartbreaking,
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
her decision, but I think what helps me is that this is a short story, and maybe it just wasn't her time. Maybe in time she'll figure it out. So that kind of helps me, and I pass.
Yeah, maybe. One critic viewed this as a sort of inversion of The Sound of Music. How do you solve a problem like Camille? Well, turns out pretty well in Sound of Music, but not necessarily here. No guarantees. But she may not be that safe in the convent either, with Father Ray casting his eyes on her too. So maybe the devil is the devil you know better than the devil you don't know. Well, let's look at the stones of the village. And I want to know how people reacted to Victor Gruber's life choices. Passing brings him a lot of success. What do you think? How did you feel as you were reading that story about the choices he was making? You on his side? Rooting for Victor? Or hoping he gets his comeuppance?
Okay, so John, I was thinking about this in terms of a present day situation. Is race something that you have to declare? Right. So if you can pass for white and you've, in a relationship or about to start a relationship with someone who identifies as white, do you have a moral obligation to let them know that, okay, my parents identify as Black or something like that? And if so, is this not problematic? If we have to start off by saying, okay, I may look like you, but there are people in my ancestry who may not have belonged to the same, I don't know, the same race as you. And I think this, it speaks to the fact that this issue of race as an identifier is questionable, very questionable, right? He looks white, he could pass for white. Why should it matter if one of his ancestors was not white? I mean, Skip Gates's series,
Finding Your Roots.
Finding Your Roots.
Yeah, love that.
Has introduced a number of people who are viewed as white, who thought that they were white. He's introduced them to their Black ancestors, much to their shock. But these people are identified as white in popular culture. So this story just raises all these questions about how problematic race as an identifier is. And as an aside, I'd encourage you to just Google pictures of Black and white twins, where you'll see pictures of people who have the same mother and father, yet one looks Black and the other looks white, yet they are twins. So does that mean that those two people who look so different belong to different races, even though they have the same parents? So when I was reading the story, I was just thinking, why should he have to declare this? Why can he not just live his best life?
Except that he has to live with a woman as his wife who he knows would reject him if she knew the past. And that's certainly a reflection on her, but it's got to be something that would eat at me if I were in that situation, to know that my wife wouldn't really accept me if she knew this basically insignificant fact about me.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, his whole life. Dan, you want to say something?
Yeah, so a more contemporary book by the person who was recent past president of the University of Cincinnati.
Mm-hmm.
His parents were Black, and he's white as can be, and he didn't know he was Black. The book is called "The Black Boy Who Thought He Was White." He had no idea that his parents were Black. He was told they were servants of his until he was 10 years old, and then he had to go live in the Black community as a white person who had been white. You know, anyway, he was president of the University of Cincinnati until recently. Mm-hmm. The Black Boy Who Thought He Was White is the name of the book. But Jerry, as John just said, it's not just what you feel, it's how you're going to be reflected by the people who you care for and love, and how they're going to deal with it.
This is Amber. One thing that this brings to mind too is how difficult we do need to, I don't want to get too far from the story, but how DNA testing is making this like a bit more complicated. And so I was asking a cousin, I was like, well, what did your DNA test say? Because I don't have mine. And I said, what does yours say? And he didn't even want to say, because I'm thinking he mostly found out that he's not as African, or we don't have as much African as we would think. And he never told me. And so I got one for my dad for his birthday, and he has 5 other siblings, well, 4 others still alive and whatever. So I got it for him. He doesn't seem to care at all. He probably forgot about all the results, but it shows more British. It shows, like, you know, when it comes, because they split it up maybe between German, Irish, whatever, and it shows more British, like, you know, than African. And so, you know, so what does that say? Like, you know, like for people who, you know, you really, you know, like, yeah, I'm Black, you know, I'm Black. And then your DNA test, you know, may say, well, actually, you're more of this, you know, and what do you do with that, or do you care? So I just thought I'd bring that up. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I love the guy that the author named this guy Victor, because his very name poses a challenge to us. Is he a victor or not? He certainly demonstrates that race is a social construct, that it's not an inherent, it's much not so much a biological thing as something society makes a big deal out of, creates race, really, because he does everything that a white person could do. He shows that whatever his background, he can do anything better than any of the white people that he deals with. He's an extremely successful attorney. He's a smart guy. He's well respected. They want him to run for office. So, you know, in a sense, his whole life shows that race is a fiction, is a social construct. And yet, he's sort of caught in this world where it does matter to a lot of people because society makes a big deal out of it. So he's
John, but he also shows the terrible prejudice of a white person.
Now that's very interesting, and that's an important point. What do you take from that? Why does he do that?
Well, I was going to mention that as well. And, you know, all throughout it, I was thinking, well, you know, he should just live his life and do what he wants, but he shouldn't be that prejudiced. He should use his own, you know, kind of thoughts to, you know, make things more inclusive, or to say, well, why do we need to be prejudiced against people of darker skin or whatever? What, you know, I kept thinking, well, why doesn't he just like rebel against that and make it so that it's not a big deal? And, you know, since I have not been in that situation, I can't say, you know, for sure why, you know, what would motivate you to draw that big of a distinction, or to say, okay, I'm going to go overboard and pretend I'm as prejudiced as can be so that they don't suspect me. Well, you know, maybe he could have, should have used his success and platform to go, yeah, really, it doesn't really matter. But that's, you know, just wishful thinking in terms of a neat story.
It seems to me like that the mortal danger of it terrified him, right? Because, you know, beyond his wife and his son or anyone else around him just rejecting him, his life was at stake, right? If he was found out to have married a white woman, he could be lynched for it, right? So, I mean, that would be terrifying to me if I was in his shoes, that if I was caught, I could be killed immediately, you know? That's what I'm thinking.
I think that figure of Pavageau is an important figure. That other attorney, the black attorney, that he's constantly running up against, and is a kind of alter ego, I think, who represents exactly what, Barb, what you're just wishing that Victor would do, become an apologist for the rights of black people. Pavageau, who is black himself, does that. And is every bit as smart as Victor is, and he thinks he's even really a better lawyer than I am. I've just got all this white privilege on my side, or you know, he'd be winning the cases if he had that kind of privilege behind him. And so I think there's a real alter ego, do a little Jungian analysis here, that these two guys are two sides of the same coin, really. Pavageau is a potential within him, within Victor, and I think Victor is a potential within Pavageau as well. not a potential he approves of or wants to give into, but something that intrigued me when I got to the end of the story. Pavageau never outs him. Remember when Victor confronts him and Pavageau says, "Just be fair to me. That's all I want. Fairness for my clients. I'm not going to expose you as long as you do that." But then Victor dies on the threshold of something, literally falls dead on a threshold. And Pavageau never gives him up, even at that point.
You know, John, I want to recommend Kate Chopin's story, Desiree's Baby.
Oh, yeah. Great story.
Desiree's Baby, for just another angle on this whole issue of race and identity and declaring one's race. And also this issue of people who are passing for white being harder sometimes on Black people than others.
Yeah, that's a great story.
Yeah.
And another New Orleans writer.
Yes, story set in
a white New Orleans writer. But
yes.
Yeah, so I think Pavageau really does understand that, yeah, maybe there's a side of him that might like to do what Victor does, but he wouldn't do it. He can't. I think his skin is darker, but even if it weren't, he wouldn't do it, but he understands. He kind of accepts that as that empathy for Victor, I think. The term that a lot of critics would apply to somebody like Victor is the tragic mulatto, which is in some ways a stereotype, but it's a character who shows up in lots of fiction in the late 19th and early 20th century. Nella Larson's book or novel Passing would be a good example of that too. This figure who could pass for white or Black and is sort of trapped between the two worlds, doesn't really fit in either one of them. Now that character, some people say, well, that's a distortion of Black identity, because to be Black in any shade of Black in a racist society is a tragic situation. You know, are you really any worse off being light-skinned or being dark-skinned? It's still a terrible burden to bear. And some people would say, well, these characters were created to appeal to a white audience because the white audience would empathize more with a character who looked a little more like them. So it's a controversial character, but it still does call into question consistently the racist society that makes a big deal out of something that shouldn't be made a big deal of at all.
Yeah, actually, John, I was going to bring up Nella Larson's Passing too as a really very complex example of the doubling of, between Irene and Claire, the friendship between Irene and Claire, who is absolutely passing for white 100% of the time by choice, and Irene, who just does it for convenience from time to time, since she can't even get herself a cup of tea when she's thirsty or whatever. And yet Irene never gives Claire up, even at great cost to herself. And I think what this just goes to show is, I think what the short story does so well, and the double characters that you brought up, what they do so well is they show that neither option is really very good. Because basically we have one character who's doing sort of the Booker T. Washington thing, with the where he has to be this exceptional Black guy. Absolutely, in order to prove that he's as good, he has to be better. And then, so really, if you think about that compared to the fact that the other one is actually just deciding it's not even worth it to have to go through that. There's a certain stress of having African-American exceptionalism, the talented 10th or whatever you want to call it. And so I think it's a fair look. The person who would choose to just entirely pass out as white, I think you gain sympathy for both characters in both stories as a result of just how unfair these expectations were. Either way, it was a lose-lose situation.
Nobody should have to make those choices. Yeah, that's just, they're artificially imposed by society.
Well, I hate to say it, but it's already 8:15. So if you want to do any kind of wrap up ideas and questions, we could go ahead and do that.
Jerry, do you want to go first?
Okay. All right. So I'll start with the part that we've been talking about. You know, this questionable identifier. You know, race as an identifier. I came to the United States, I didn't even know which color my eyes were because it was irrelevant. And it wasn't until I tried to get a driver's license, you know, then I had to fill out the form like, okay. So I put down black, right? I went home, looked, and then I realized my eyes were brown, right? And it raised these questions about why do these kinds of things matter? Why does the color of my eyes matter, or the color of my skin? Why should it matter? Right. So I'm reading all these stories, and I'm seeing, you know, people grappling with this just after slavery, you know, has been abolished, but slavery still continues, and just like slavery continuing, the prejudice tied to the whole slave infrastructure continues. So we're reading this stuff. It seems like, well, this happened a long time ago, but these things could happen today. They could happen today, and they would still be the same kinds of issues if someone were passing for white when their parents identified as Black, or one of their parents identified as Black. It would still be problematic. And if it would still be problematic, that suggests that we haven't moved forward from the issue of race during the slavery era. So when people say, oh, slavery happened a long time ago, no one is alive who went through that kind of experience, so we should just move forward. These stories illustrate that indeed these problems still exist. And if you have to hide your identity in order to move forward, then you are in a form of slavery. Because you cannot live freely as you are. So these stories are just a reminder that we have a lot of work to do, and we haven't moved far enough from the slavery days. So that's my comment there. And then for the Chestnut Stories, I am, you know, I'm just rediscovering, you know, my love for this stuff, particularly the dialect stuff, because I'm in the working on a project right now, as I said earlier, in which I'm finding Africanisms in American English. And there's so many of them in the language that we speak that we don't even realize, you know, words like shanty, words like jazz. All of these are words that come from African languages, and you can actually identify the languages that they came from. And so it's really exciting for me to read this and then see the dialect and think, oh my goodness, here are some expressions that I can actually connect to a specific African language. So those are some of the comments that I have. I could say a lot more, but I don't want to dominate the time. So go ahead.
So my closing reflection would be this, and very similar to what Jerry said at the beginning, all four stories remind us that the effects of slavery remain. Chestnut transforms the Southern white Joel Chandler Harris's smiling Uncle Remus into the trickster Julius McAdoo, who tells stories for his own purposes. Through the characters John and Annie in the frame, Chestnut, who has lived in both the North and the South, shows that whites in both regions have a responsibility to temper their desire for profit with compassion and empathy. Alice Dunbar Nelson portrays racism that abolition could not reach, and that was reasserting its influence during the post-Reconstruction lives of both authors. In Camille and Victor, she shows that race is not biological, but a social construct, which becomes a determining factor in people's lives, not because it has to, but because American society makes it so. And both authors look back to slavery for its enduring influence and forward to the rising Black sense of identity and pride that will develop with the Harlem Renaissance in the last 2 decades of their lives. More on that in a couple of months when we discuss Langston Hughes. But next month, it'll be Richard Wright.
I was gonna say, all right. So thank you, John, and thank you, Jerry. This has been a great conversation, as always. And I was just going to mention, yes, the April 7th date is the author Richard Wright, Uncle Tom is Dead. So I know there will be some connections that we can make there. But I believe all of the readings are linked on our website, and that the Eventbrite thing is linked as well. So you can go ahead and register for next month's discussion. And I just want to thank all of you for joining us tonight, and make sure you check out the Harriet Beecher Stowe website to see all of our great programming that is coming up throughout the year, and also pictures of the restoration project. So thank you all for your participation tonight. And I will send out, because we're doing some surveying things with the Ohio History Connection, just so we can get some ideas on how things are going. And I will send you a link to that survey probably sometime tomorrow. All right. Thank you all. I appreciate it. Have a good evening.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.